Good day. Today is Monday, 9th December, and, well, my voice is slightly better than it was yesterday, though it is still not 100%. But in any event, events continue to move very fast, and I'm going to proceed with this video. I hope that my voice holds together till the end. Yesterday's video, as many people correctly pointed out, lasted for 85 minutes. We'll see how long this one lasts. Anyway, the two big events that continue to dominate the news is the events in Syria, which in fact are the single topic that the news media is filled with, and of course the continued conflict in Ukraine. Now, because of the scale of the events in Syria, it's a case that there's been less discussion and coverage recently of events in Ukraine, which in a sense is unfortunate, because I'm going to suggest that in fact we have seen extremely consequential developments over the last 48 hours. I touched on them briefly in my program yesterday, but I'm going to turn first to the situation in Syria. And the first thing to say is that it is now, I think, widely accepted that President Assad, or former President Assad of Syria, is now in Moscow, where apparently on the decision of none other than Vladimir Putin himself, he has been granted political asylum. Now, I have been getting reports from a source about Russian activities in Syria. They've been very, very interesting. They give me a strong sense that the Russians, at least on the military side, have been caught by surprise by recent events, and it's not surprising that that should be the case. But this source did tell me some days ago that, to his knowledge, Assad's family were already in Moscow, and he also informed me several hours before it was even confirmed that President Assad had stepped down, that Assad was at least heading towards Moscow. And another source, completely different person, somebody with privileged access to flight data, was able to track the movements of President Assad's plane. It seems, from what I can tell, that President Assad left Damascus perhaps the day before the city finally fell. He went to Latakia, where the Russian airbase at Khmeimim is located. His aircraft apparently was there. It took off. It then followed a very complicated route. At one point, it disappeared from radar contacts, almost certainly. That was arranged by the Russians. And anyway, one way or the other, by yesterday, he was definitely in Moscow, where, as I said, he and his family were granted political asylum. I understand, and I'm going now back to my first source, that other members of his family, people who were less close to him than his immediate family, about whom I will be saying more in a moment, that they were also collected by the Russians, specifically by Wagner people, and that they are in Moscow also. So the entire Assad clan has been evacuated to Moscow by the Russians. There is a report circulating, and I think this is probably true, that the sequence of events in tracking Assad's movements over the last couple of weeks was as follows. He actually came to Moscow with his immediate family, with his wife and other children, to attend the graduation ceremony of one of his sons, who was graduated from a Russian further education university. Importantly, the family, including his wife and children, remained in Moscow whilst he returned to Damascus. Now, this was before the jihadi offensive on the 27th of November began. And it's been suggested that the fact that the family remained in Moscow, even as Assad himself returned to Damascus, indicates that there was some pre-knowledge of what was about to happen, and that Assad was making sure that he was putting his immediate family out of harm's way before the events that we have seen took place. Now, first of all, I should say that I don't know that this is the case, but it is a fact that there is a genuine enigma about Assad's conduct over the last couple of months. And though I don't intend to devote an inordinate amount of time to Syria in this program, I do want to, before I touch on that, come back to discuss some of the causes of the events that have taken place over the last few weeks. And I have been doing so now in several programs, and I think this will be the last mention of this, discussion of this, that I will make until we start to get much more substantive information, until some people, specifically perhaps Assad himself, starts giving us some further information about what actually happened. So let me say a few things. First of all, I think it is absolutely clear to me that this was a regime change operation. I want to make this absolutely clear. This was not by any means a popular revolution. There's been claims that the people of Syria are celebrating the falls of the dictator. Of course, images, pictures, film of what is happening across Syria is very difficult to come by and extremely difficult to assess at the moment. Certainly there have been some crowds out celebrating Assad's fall, including in his own former bastion, which is Latakia. Any opinion about that I make from the remote distance of London is going to be very impressionistic. But my overall sense is that this is not a huge uprising of jubilation across Syria at the fall of Assad. Obviously, there are opponents of President Assad in Syria. There always have been. Also, there are people who, when a big event happens, come out because they want to be there as history is made. But my overwhelming impression, that was clear, for example, when Aleppo fell, is that the vast majority of people in Syria are in shock, that they're as stunned by the speed of events as everybody, or as most people are in the outside world. Most people have stayed at home. I've seen many pictures of deserted streets and neighborhoods as people probably huddle together, frightened and worried about what is to come. Certainly, there doesn't seem to have been any huge protest wave in Damascus or Aleppo or in Homs or Hama or in any one of these places. There was also very little fighting. And again, this is a point which I've made before, but I want to reiterate. A very well organized, very well armed and equipped, to some extent reasonably well trained jihadi force invaded Syria. I understand mostly from Turkey, not in fact from Idlib province, entered Syria and advanced south towards Damascus, meeting no significant military resistance. The size of this force, many people, very few people have given it an exact number, but Alistair Crook, in a program that Glenn Deason and I did with him about 2 weeks ago, I think 10 days ago, right at the very start of this affair, he put the number at about 15,000, and my guess is that that is probably right. Now, this is not a force sufficient in size, one would have thought, to conquer a whole country like Syria. And I ought to say that I've been reading commentaries from various Russian bloggers, specifically the person who writes and tweets under the name Russians with Attitude, but there have been others as well, who not only commented about the fact that there was very, very little fighting, but who've also made the point that when fighting did take place, even if on a very limited scale, the jihadis never pressed home their attacks and in fact fell back. That, for example, happened in Hama, where briefly, at one point, jihadi fighters were able to enter Hama. Then the Syrian army arrived and they almost immediately withdrew. So that there was very, very little fighting. In fact, Russians with Attitudes went even further and said that, in his opinion, a single brigade of Russian infantry would have been sufficient to stop this entire advance. Of course, such a brigade in Syria was not there. That might be an exaggeration, but anyway, that's what this person said. So, a regime change operation, not a popular uprising, not a war. Somehow, in some way, some kind of transfer of power was engineered. And here we come back to who were the prime actors. And obviously there were the jihadi fighters, and obviously there were the military commanders and the other civilian officials on the government side. But clearly there were more actors involved as well. Now, inevitably, in any discussion of this conflict, people focus on the United States and on Israel, and if one follows Iranian commentary especially, they have tended to single out those two parties. Let me say now, and without any hesitation, that I have no doubt that the Americans were involved in some way. In fact, President Biden is taking credit for the whole thing, even as I'm making this program. So the Americans were involved in some way. So were the British, undoubtedly, and the French, probably, and the Israelis too. But whatever their exact role, it's obvious that the major party in this operation was Turkey and President Erdogan. It was in Turkey that this jihadi force was assembled, where it was trained, where it was organized, and it was from Turkey that the advance into Syria was ordered, and it was in Turkey that the operations room, the headquarters that directed the entire operation, was located. So I think whatever role the Americans, the Israelis, the British, the French, and others might have had, it is to Turkey that we must look to find the main player. Now, people also discuss the background to these events, the economic crisis in Syria, the Caesar sanctions, the effect of the Caesar sanctions, those kind of things. And many people say that this played the most important role in what took place. And one can see some people on the Syrian side, the Syrian government side, or at least people who've been supporters of the Syrian government, also now increasingly talking about this. And I should say that there's also some commentaries to this effect on it appearing in Iran as well. And let me make it absolutely clear that, of course, the sanctions, the economic siege to which Syria was subjected, played a very important role. However, and to repeat once more, governments do not collapse simply because there is a major economic problems in the country. Armies do not melt away for those reasons. It is unhistorical to suppose so. Clearly, the sanctions, the economic crisis, was essential background. But if one is looking at events in Syria, there must have been some more proximate cause. We're talking about a large army, the Syrian army, one that had recently successfully won a war, a prolonged war, one which was backed by the Russian Air Force, one which should certainly have been capable of resisting the invasion force that we saw. And that brings me back now to the enigma, the ultimate enigma, the mystery of President Assad's own actions. Because anybody who has been following the events of the last couple of weeks cannot have failed but notice the extraordinary passivity that he showed. He never once addressed the Syrian people. He made no public appearances. He did not convene the Syrian parliament. He did not go to the front lines and meet the soldiers. He did not give any stirring addresses to the troops. He made one telephone call that I know of to, of all people, the president of Abkhazia, a country which is not even recognized by most of the world, and which is a small place in the northern Caucasus. It is almost as if he wasn't there. And in his absence, all sorts of other people were purporting to speak for the government, the Syrian Defense Ministry, various officials, but none of them obviously could speak with the authority that President Assad himself could have done. And this passivity, we're now being told, especially by sources in Iran, long predated the events of the last few weeks. According to the Iranians, and this has been said now by the foreign minister, Mr. Arakchi, but also by other Iranian officials, according to the Iranians, they were giving him, Assad, repeated warnings that there was a deterioration of the situation on the northern border, that large jihadi forces were assembling in Idlib province and in southern Turkey. Apparently, Assad was visited all the way back in June by a strong Iranian delegation that tried to explain all of this to him. In fact, there are photos which show Assad meeting this Iranian delegation. And the Iranians came away from their meetings with Assad feeling that he was not paying much attention to what they were saying. And the Iranians also are saying that Assad gradually began to distance himself from his own primary supporters and allies, including the Iranians themselves and the various other military and military groups and communities that had stood by him during the war, that he spent a great deal of time trying to mend fences with the Arab states, particularly the Gulf monarchies, something which, by the way, I think he was absolutely right to do. That's not something I personally would criticize him for. Getting Syria readmitted to the Arab League was an important thing, and it can certainly not be qualified as a mistake. But it seems that Assad did accept, or at least the Iranians claim, that he did accept assurances from the Arab states, and perhaps even, and this is what the Iranians say, from the West, that provided he didn't do certain steps, and it's not clear what those steps were, he would be left alone. And here I'm guessing that this is all somehow connected with the events that started on the 7th October 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, and that there were lots of fears and expectations at the time that this would lead to a wider war in the Middle East. And it's not implausible that officials from Western countries, and by Western countries one presumably means the United States, contacted in some way Assad, the government in Damascus, and told them that if they didn't escalate the situation so as to cause a wider war, then there would be no overall attack on them. Well, this is comments and commentaries that I've seen from Iran, and of course we don't know how true these are, and it may be that the Iranians are busy constructing their own alibi, and perhaps Assad himself has other things to say, completely different things to say. But that he did act in a passive way during the crisis itself and in the weeks before, I think that is really indisputable. Now, I think it was in my program yesterday that I discussed Assad's non-attendance at the BRICS summit in Kazan. After I made the program and after my voice was fully back, was fully restored, I checked, I went and looked to see who actually had attended the BRICS summit in Kazan and who did meet with Putin in Kazan. And I found that all sorts of people went to Kazan, including, by the way, people like the president of Mauritania and the leader of the Serb enclave in Bosnia, and all sorts of people like that, Republika Srpska. But Assad himself did not go. He didn't go to Kazan. And I clearly recall that the Russians had been expecting him to come and were disappointed and surprised that he didn't. And clearly, or so it seems to me, this was a massive missed opportunity. Perhaps in some ways, the final event, which made it impossible, set up the situation that we have seen play out since. Because, of course, if Assad had gone to Kazan, he would have met Putin, he would have met Xi Jinping, he would have met other leaders there. That would have impressed on people in Syria. I'm talking about the government officials in Syria, that he was not only fully in control, but fully in control of Syria's international diplomacy, and that he was engaging with some of the world's most powerful countries, and that he had their implicit backing. Best of all, if he'd met with Erdogan in Kazan, that might have started to open up a dialogue between Syria and Turkey, which, to repeat, at that time is all that Erdogan was asking for. And who knows, perhaps in return for meeting with Erdogan and engaging Erdogan in discussions and talking about some kind of process of national reconciliation in Syria in which Turkey would have a role, who knows, perhaps Erdogan in turn might have been persuaded. Remember, the Russians were there, the Chinese were there, all sorts of friends of Syria were there. Perhaps in Kazan, Erdogan might have been persuaded to agree to or support a bid by Syria for BRICS partnership status. Now, that would not automatically have made Syria a BRICS state, but it would have again given people in Syria reason to hope that the economic siege imposed on them would someday be lifted. So it made absolute political and diplomatic sense for Assad to go to Kazan, and he didn't do so. And there's never been an explanation, a cogent explanation for that, except, of course, what was undoubtedly the real reason, which is that he did not want to meet Erdogan. His father, Hafez al-Assad, the man who built up the modern state of Syria in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and who I remember very well, he undoubtedly would have gone to Kazan. He'd have met with Putin and Xi, probably Modi and all of the others. He would certainly have met with Erdogan. And in fact, given the personalities of the two men, which, from my memory, in some respects, resembled each other, who knows? But they might even have found a common language. But Assad chose not to go. And ultimately, this passivity in the face of an increasingly difficult situation would have caused confidence in Assad, in Damascus, gradually to drain away. And this does happen. I've seen it happen myself. Leaders who find themselves overwhelmed by events, not just leaders of countries, but leaders of businesses, withdraw into themselves, start living from day to day. The problems mount and the confidence is lost. And I suspect that something like that happened. Now, there have been reports that President Assad's wife, to whom it is well known that he is devoted, has been very seriously ill recently, and it may be that that has played a role, or it may be that there have been other problems as well, and that Assad anyway has had to face conflicting pressures in Damascus, which he has never felt able to reconcile. Several people on the threads to my previous videos have correctly pointed out that Assad is not a natural politician. He did not emerge out of Damascus politics in the same way that his father did. He was not originally intended to be his father's successor. That was his elder brother Basil, who, unlike Assad himself, had a background in the military. It could be that even as Assad found his way and his voice during the war, the intractable or seemingly intractable political and economic and diplomatic problems that Syria faced after the end of the war meant that he couldn't win the peace. Now, even saying all of that doesn't, as I said, provide a sufficient explanation for everything. Again, I continue to receive many reports about how Assad was persuaded or chose to replace all the senior officers in the army, basically retiring all of the officers who had won the war. I've seen this said so many times that I now accept that it must be true. Though I have to say that I have not yet seen any details. But the point is that without leadership from him, strong, consistent leadership from him, these people who were running the Syrian military and may have concluded that the president himself had basically given up hope, that there was no real prospect of success in conducting resistance. So why should they put themselves at risk by holding out? Undoubtedly, there must have been contacts between many commanders, and I suspect Turkish intelligence over several months, perhaps years. It's been suggested that this whole operation took some 6 months to plan and prepare, and obviously people after some point decided to accept payoffs, and a transition of power process was thereby agreed. And that, it seems to me, is what we have basically seen. A negotiated transition of power from Assad to a motley collection of people who Erdogan appears to believe that he can control. Now, the interesting thing about this is that even as Erdogan appears to have these beliefs, he continues to go out of his way to try to reassure the Russians that he remains their friend. So he's made some really extraordinary comments, for example, about Putin, which clearly are intended to some extent to flatter Putin at this particular juncture in this unbelievably complex relationship that Russia and Turkey have with each other. So he said that now there are only two experienced leaders in the world. They are myself, Vladimir Putin. I'm not saying this because one of them is me, but I've been in office for 22 years, nearly as long as Mr. Putin. The rest are gone, and we want our dialogue to continue. That is the most important sentence, by the way. It is important to continue politics. For instance, politics ended in Germany when Angela Merkel resigned. So what he's basically telling Putin is, look, despite everything that's happened in Syria, let's keep the show between us on the road. You know, basically, that I double-crossed you. But nonetheless, we can still work together. Sometimes you win one over me, sometimes I win one over you. But our mutual interest is so strong, and our relationship with each other goes back so far that it would be foolish at this time to end it all now. And by the way, the Russians, furious though they are, John Helmer at Dances with Bears has written a fascinating piece about the recriminations and anger that there is in Moscow, and the way in which various people within the Kremlin and the Defense Ministry and the General Staff are criticizing each other and over what they collectively see as a debacle in Syria. Anyway, angry as the Russians are, I suspect that for the reasons of realpolitik that I have discussed before, the need to maintain economic relations with Turkey, the need to keep NATO warships out of the Black Sea, all of those things, the Russians will, in the end, grind their teeth and decide to go along with things, just as Erdogan is saying. And in the meantime, the Russian bases in Syria, in Latakia province, once a bastion of support for President Assad, but now confirmed to be under the control of the jihadi fighters who have entered Tartus city. The Russian bases continue to operate unmolested and unattacked, and I suspect there have been clear orders, instructions to the jihadi fighters about this from Ankara. And a whole succession of officials, if one can call them that, of the new government have now been making all kinds of statements saying that they want good relations with Russia. There's no hard feelings for the fact that the Russians supported President Assad. There's been no statement that the bases will be allowed to stay, but there have even been some hints to that effect. I don't think that anybody in Moscow, least of all Putin himself, believes any of this, and I am fairly sure that, just as Helmer says, work is now underway in Moscow to get all of the Russians in Syria evacuated and to close down the bases, and to do so under safe conduct agreed with Erdogan. Just saying. But all of that, all of those indications, all those promises and assurances continue to be given. And again, I am sure that this reflects Erdogan's wishes and instructions. I think that Erdogan has miscalculated disastrously. I think that he could have withdrawn the Turkish troops from Syria. He could have met with Assad on that basis. Perhaps some kind of understanding between the two could have been reached. All of the things that Erdogan presumably wanted, the Americans pushed out of eastern Syria, the unity and integrity of Syria preserved, something which is important for Turkey. They do not want Kurdish statelets establishing themselves on Syrian territory. All of that could probably have been achieved without doing the things that have now been done. I think that Erdogan is almost certainly miscalculating if he thinks that he can control the situation in Syria and specifically in Damascus. Already the Israelis have made their move. Perhaps they coordinated this with Erdogan, but the fact that the Israelis are now occupying the Golan Heights, the remaining part of the Golan Heights, reports that some Israeli forces have moved even further east, all the way to the town of Duran. I can't imagine that that is going to help destabilize the situation in Syria itself for very long. The Israelis, by the way, have mounted a whole massive series of bombing strikes right across Syria over the last couple of hours. The primary target are the wreckage of what was once Syria's fairly modern and advanced air defense system. There's pictures circulating of Buk missile launchers and Panzer systems acquired from Russia, which have been destroyed. Clearly the Israelis are anxious that none of this equipment falls into the hands of the jihadi fighters and their sponsors. So all of that is taking place. Erdogan now has to contend with a country where the institutions of government are likely to collapse. I strongly suspect that over the next few months and years, he's going to have a major problem and headache on his hands. But there it is. he was determined to re-establish Turkish influence in Syria. At one point, he wanted to remove Assad. Then when the Russians came to Assad's rescue, he wanted to come to some kind of agreement with Assad. When Assad seemed to lose his way, he achieved it. Now, as I said, he's got this massive problem. Perhaps he doesn't realize fully how big it's going to be, but there it is. A tragedy again for the Syrian people, a tragedy for Bashar al-Assad personally, who has failed completely in the task that he set himself. Perhaps at some time he will come forward and he will tell us a bit more about what truly took place. I'm going to finish this summary of events in Syria by quickly adding that, contrary to what some assume, I understand that Russian reinforcements continue to arrive at the bases, in the 2 Russian bases in Syria. That is not, in my opinion, intended to establish a permanent presence there. Rather, it is intended to secure the bases in advance of what I suspect will be a general withdrawal of the Russians from Syria taking place over the next few months. Well, there it is. The end of the Syrian chapter. The Russians themselves, angry, embarrassed, humiliated, and furious, their larger plans to establish a strategic presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, one which has been indulged by Russian leaders ever since the 1940s, when Stalin first proposed at the Yalta Conference that the Soviet Union be allowed a naval base in Libya. The Americans and the British refused, by the way. Anyway, this latest iteration of that attempt by the Russians to establish a permanent naval and military presence in the Mediterranean has again been dashed. I suspect that those voices in Moscow, which have always said that getting entangled in Arab and Syrian and Mediterranean affairs was a mistake, will be massively strengthened. But the Russians, unlike the Turks and the Israelis, and by the way, to some extent, the Americans, and of course the Iranians, they can actually walk away from this mess. Their investment in Syria, though big in some respects, has been marginal in economic and military terms. So they can pull out, concentrate on the things that really matter to them, and let Syria take care of itself. And that, it seems to me, is what they're now going to do. Well, this is my, I hope, last big piece on Syria for the moment. Over the next few weeks, we will probably start to hear more explanations of what took place. As I said, perhaps an interview to the Russian media or the Middle Eastern media by Assad himself. Perhaps whatever Syrian officials survive, and I suspect many of them are going to face retribution over the next few weeks, days and weeks and months. Anyway, whatever other Syrian officials survive, they might give their own explanations. We will no doubt at some point learn an awful lot more, and then it will be appropriate to revisit this topic. But for the moment, at least, I think I have said all that I can realistically say about this crisis. To repeat again, it was a regime change operation undoubtedly. The Americans, the Israelis, the British, the French were no doubt at some level involved, though Turkey was definitely the main actor. And to be honest, I don't myself get the sense that this time round, unlike what happened previously, the Americans were the main or the central players. I think that they were sidelined by Erdogan, who has his own game to play, and who has repeatedly shown that he is ultimately his own man. So anyway, a regime change operation. The sanctions did play a part, but for a final explanation of why Syria failed, we need to learn more about what was going on inside the government itself, inside the military and the presidential apparatus, within the regime, if you prefer to use that word. And until we have that information, I don't think there is much more to say. Let me now turn to other matters. Now, I said yesterday that because of the overriding focus that there has been on the conflict in Syria, people have not been paying sufficient attention to the latest comments and statements by Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, to repeat again, is the president-elect of the United States. On the 20th of January, he is going to become the president of the United States, in control of the United States government. He appears to be in a immeasurably stronger position than he was when he was previously elected president in 2016. At this point, after his election in 2016, he and his team were the target of allegations that they had somehow stolen the election through some kind of elaborate conspiracy that they'd plotted together with the Russians. All kinds of investigations were being launched. Trump's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, was being monitored by the FBI and the US intelligence community, and was eventually arrested, prosecuted, and from memory, briefly imprisoned. All sorts of other people were being investigated as well. The media in Britain, the United States, and across the West was full of fantastical stories about what the Russians had been up to with Trump, all of which, by the way, proved to be untrue. And, well, there was even some doubt that the Electoral College would actually confirm Trump as president at all. And, of course, after it did, he had a meeting with the heads of the intelligence community, and the director of the FBI, James Comey, stayed behind and presented Trump with the information that was contained in the Steele dossier, which made all kinds of salacious allegations against Trump. And Trump came away from that meeting convinced that Comey and the FBI were trying to blackmail him. Well, we have nothing like that this time. Trump is having some problems getting some of his people confirmed by the Senate. There is a holdout group of Republican senators led basically by Mitch McConnell, who has made, by the way, a deeply provocative speech contradicting Donald Trump's America First foreign policy, insisting that the United States should continue to follow the neocon line in determining foreign policy. Anyway, there continues to be a holdout group of Republican senators in the Senate who are clearly intent on causing Trump as much trouble as they can and trying to block some of his nominations. He's already seen Matt Gaetz fall by the wayside. He's having some difficulties getting Pete Hegseth across the line. He's doing the right thing, in my opinion, which is backing Hegseth and the others to the hilt. That's not, by the way, an endorsement from me of Hegseth. I've no idea what kind of defense secretary he will make. But if Trump, at this point, starts to engage in complex negotiations with McConnell about the makeup of the cabinet, then Trump will rapidly lose control of the whole process. And the fact that he's refusing to do it shows that he understands it. Anyway, the point is that there is this little group in the Senate that is resisting him. But overall, Trump is in firm control of the Republican Party. The House of Representatives, the party in the House of Representatives, backs him. He won a clear victory in the election. Nobody seriously doubts that he will become soon the duly, constitutionally, democratically, if you wish, elected President of the United States. So he is in a very, very strong position. And he showed it. He's just been to Paris, supposedly to attend the celebrations for the re-inauguration of Notre Dame, which was badly damaged in a fire some 3 years ago. And Trump was there, and importantly, Biden was not. And if there is a case of how people turn to the rising sun and tend to overlook the setting sun, well, we saw that play out in Paris. Macron, to the irritation, I suspect, of some of the other European leaders, was going out of his way to court Trump, and Trump was acting absolutely as the man of the hour, the man who would soon be in control. And one of the other leaders who was there was, of course, President Zelensky of Ukraine. And I have to say that, to me, it appeared as if Trump treated him rather brutally. Apparently, the two men had a meeting, but apparently it only lasted for all of 20 minutes. In the commentary that appeared afterwards, there was all kinds of talk from members of Trump's team, including apparently Roger Stone, that Zelensky turning up in his camouflage fatigues and the rest of his costume was seen as somehow disrespectful. Something which, of course, Biden's people never said. Trump repeatedly said that Ukraine had indicated that it was willing to agree a ceasefire. He said that after the meeting with Zelensky. Zelensky contradicted him, but then Trump went on and repeated it again. It's almost as if Trump was saying things for Zelensky which are different from what Zelensky himself has said. And Zelensky's exasperation and irritation at being treated in this way has become all too clear. Then Trump also gave figures for Ukrainian casualties. Now, he also gave figures for Russian casualties. He said that figures for that the Russians have lost some 600,000 casualties in the war. The Russians, Peskov, have flatly contradicted this. They said that these are estimates that come from Ukrainian sources, but I don't think the Russians are particularly bothered by what Trump has said, because they're used to all of these claims coming from the West. and from the Americans. But Trump also said, and this will have infuriated Zelensky and the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians have also lost around 400,000 men in casualties. By the way, I'm in no position either to confirm or refute that figure. The Russian figures are higher. They're over 500,000. I've said in the past that there's reason to think that the Russian figures might actually be within a ballpark of being correct. They do sometimes receive corroboration from accidental releases of information that the Ukrainians themselves give out. But, I'm not going to pretend that I know with any detail or certainty what the true casualty numbers on either side in fact are. But the point is that Trump was giving a figure for Ukrainian casualties that the Ukrainians themselves have never acknowledged. And Zelensky was furious about it. He said that this was completely untrue. He'd previously said that Ukrainian deaths were fewer than 80,000. He then came out with a figure of 43,000, which he said was the total number of people that had died on the Ukrainian side in the war. I don't think anyone takes that number seriously. It looks to me as if what Zelensky was trying to do was divide Trump's number, which is casualties, by the way, not deaths, by 10. Anyway, Zelensky was furious. And he has again said that Ukraine is not interested or prepared for a ceasefire. That all these claims from Trump that Ukraine does intend to seek a ceasefire are simply untrue. Ukraine will only agree a ceasefire if it has a solid security guarantees from the West. And Zelensky has made clear over the last couple of weeks that he means by that full NATO membership. And again, an angry and embarrassed Zelensky has now said that what Trump says is inconsequential, that the person who really matters is the man who's actually still the president of the United States, who is none other than Joe Biden, and that he intends to approach Joe Biden now in order to get from Biden in the remaining weeks of Biden's presidency a formal invitation to join NATO. So one can see that Trump has gone out of his way to offend Zelensky. And I am going to say what I think here. I'm sure there will be some pushback about this, but I get the clear sense that Trump was doing this on purpose, as he often does. He likes to play, sometimes, a game of cat and mouse with people. I don't say that he does it all the time. I don't think he has much time for Zelensky. His behavior over the last couple of days all but confirms that. And I think that is what he has been doing now. And the fact that he doesn't like Zelensky, by the way, is unsurprising. Zelensky, when he went to the United States back in September, initially didn't seem to be that interested in meeting with Trump. He did eventually meet with Trump after there was quite a lot of debate and discussion and argument and complaints from the Republicans about the fact that the Ukrainians seem to be backing the Democrats in the election. At one point, as I remember, Zelensky was pleading to meet with Trump in order to smooth ruffled feathers, and eventually a rather awkward meeting took place in Trump Tower. I remember the meeting ended with a beaming and very jovial looking Trump and a glowering and frankly unhappy looking Zelensky. So that meeting didn't go particularly well. But then Zelensky got his own back because a few weeks later he made a speech to the Ukrainian parliament in which he said that if Ukraine wasn't granted NATO membership, it would pursue a nuclear weapons program. Because he didn't say it at the parliament, as I remember. He said it in various comments at about the same time as he made that speech. But he said that, if the West didn't endorse his victory plan and offer Ukraine immediate NATO membership, then Ukraine would seek the only real guarantee for security that was left to it. It would seek to obtain nuclear weapons. And he said that he disclosed or claimed that he had said that very thing to Donald Trump over the course of their meeting at Trump Tower, something which I suspect Trump would not have been happy to have seen, heard at all. So anyway, there we are. There's been a difficult relationship already between the two men. I think that Trump has no particular reason to like Zelensky. His two recent meetings with Zelensky don't seem to have gone especially well. But the point is that Trump is now signaling in the clearest terms that he does want to see the war end, or at least America's role in the war end. And he says that he wants a ceasefire. He says that he wants the madness that is the war to come to a stop. He said at various times that the war was avoidable, about which, by the way, he's absolutely right. He said that hundreds of thousands of people have been casualties in the war, and putting aside the arguments about the exact numbers, about that, he is right also. And he has now also gone ahead and given television interviews in which he has told the Ukrainians, warned the Ukrainians, that the flow of funding from the United States, that they should expect it to lessen. So he's making, I think, very clear what his overall wishes about the war are. There are also reports in the US media that when Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, came to Washington a few days ago, before Trump traveled to Paris and met with members of the Trump team and floated the possibility of a ceasefire provided the Russians withdrew back to the February 2022 lines. The Trump team made it crystal clear that they thought that was completely unrealistic. I should say that it is not only completely unrealistic, it is also fantastical. And contrary to widespread belief, I don't think it was ever something that the Russians agreed to in the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. The story that was what the Russians agreed in Istanbul has been widely canvassed, but I have never seen the text, and I think it is extremely unlikely. Today, it is inconceivable, quite apart from the fact that the Russians have fought hard to expand the area of control to include most of Donbass and Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. I think it is inconceivable that the Russians would hand back to the Ukrainians the great port of Mariupol, port city of Mariupol, on the Sea of Azov, that they would sacrifice the land bridge to Crimea that they have now obtained and which they have developed. And of course, it is inconceivable that they would ever agree to the return of towns like Avdiivka and Krasnogorovka and villages like Pesky within easy distance of the center of Donetsk, which were once used by the Ukrainians to shell that city. So I think that this is a fantasy, and it is an encouraging thing that the Trump team apparently completely shot that idea down. My own sense is that Trump personally doesn't particularly care where the ceasefire line is, provided that eventually there is a ceasefire. And I think, based on the tone and comments that he has made, I think that if Trump eventually comes round to the view that the only way of getting a ceasefire is to accept what the Russians say, that it must include the entire territory of the 4 regions, he is not going to make a big issue of it. If the Russians are able to capture the full territory of the 4 regions over the next few months, I don't think that is a matter of undue concern to him. Just saying. What he wants, in my opinion, is American involvement in the war to an end. That is what he is communicating to Zelensky, who he neither likes, nor respects, nor takes seriously. It is what he is communicating to the Ukrainians. It is what he is communicating to the Europeans as well. All the talk, discussions that there have been over the last few weeks, ever since the November election, about plans to freeze the conflicts and all of those things, have not moved Trump at all. He simply wants American involvement in the war to end, and he will take whatever terms he thinks will achieve that, provided, obviously, that they do not impact on core American interests. That is my own reading of Trump's position. Now, I think it's something that governments in Europe need to understand and acknowledge. It is something that the Ukrainians also need to understand and acknowledge. After the 20th of January, as long as it takes, this disastrous slogan that the Biden administration has adopted, and it is only a slogan, it is not a policy, as long as it takes, ends. And the Europeans may have all sorts of elaborate plans about deploying troops in Ukraine, about ceasefires, about all those kind of things. But they have to realize the fact that without the United States, these plans are going nowhere, and that Trump himself is not interested in them. Now, Trump did also say that neither he nor his team have had any contacts with the Russians at all throughout the period of the transition. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is a legacy of that disastrous transition period in 2016 and early 2017, the previous transition between Obama and Trump, which has obviously embedded itself in Trump's memory. And which he does not intend to revisit. Because at that time, the Trump team did attempt some degree of outreach to the Russians. It was not on any very significant scale. Michael Flynn, Trump's national security advisor, had a telephone call with the Russian ambassador. The US intelligence community were listening in and making a recording and prosecuted him on the basis of that call after they were put up to do it by people in the White House claiming that there'd been a violation of the Logan Act. Just say. Other people within Trump's team were also supposed to have been in touch with the Russians in some way. His first campaign chief, Paul Manafort, was relentlessly investigated. Another person whose name I've, by the way, forgotten now, who visited Moscow in the summer and made a speech at a university in Moscow. He was also placed under surveillance through completely illicit, in my opinion, warrants obtained through completely wrong, which disregarded proper procedural processes. Anyway, all of that, Trump does not want to go through that again. But it seems to me that what we can now see is that though Trump does most definitely intend to speak to the Russians in January, I predict, by the way, that Putin is going to be one of the first people that Trump will want to speak to. And I would not be surprised if we see a summit meeting between Putin and Trump agreed at some point in the new year, though I'm not definitely saying that this will happen. But in the meantime, until that dialogue with the Russians can take place, Trump's people and Trump himself are going through the motions of listening to what the Ukrainians and the Europeans are saying, but I don't think they are taking it especially seriously. Now, as I said, I appreciate that many people will push back on a lot of what I have said. They will say that I'm reading more into Trump's words than I should, but I have been following Trump since 2015. I've seen Trump, the politician, in action, and I think I've come to understand him reasonably well. And that basically is my take on him. And if the Europeans and the Ukrainians put all this together and understand that as long as it takes is indeed just about over, then they will change and adapt their policies, and they will step forward and begin those negotiations as soon as they can. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to say that the Russians, over the last 24 hours, have started to harden their positions again. And we've had comments about the Russian position in negotiations from Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Galuzin. And Galuzin was speaking, he was giving an interview actually earlier today to Russia's official TASS news agency. And TASS summarizes it as follows. The senior Russian diplomat, that's to say Galuzin, noted that any future talks on the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis should be based on Russian President Vladimir Putin's previously laid out proposals, and the West, along with the Kiev regime, must demonstrate their readiness to negotiate. We see that the West has not yet even bothered to tell the Kiev regime to lift its self-ban on talks with Russian leaders. We have never shut the door on talks and remain open to them. It is the Kiev regime and its Western puppeteers who are obstructing dialogue. And then TASS summarizes Putin's proposals, which he set out in his speech in mid-June, which he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry. And we're told that these included Ukraine withdrawing troops from Donbass and Novorossiya, abandoning plans to join NATO. Moscow insists that all Western sanctions be lifted and Ukraine's non-bloc and non-nuclear status be guaranteed. And then we're told that Peskov said on December the 4th that there are no grounds for talks with the Ukrainians yet, and that the Russians are looking for not just a commitment from Ukraine to stay out of NATO, but that for the Russians, that commitment and acceptance by Ukraine that it will not join NATO is something that Ukraine must publicly confirm before a ceasefire can take place. So here we are. It looks to me as if the Russians are now making a statement from Ukraine that there will be no NATO membership by Ukraine. Ukraine accepting non-bloc status. That must actually precede a ceasefire. Ukraine must commit to that before a ceasefire can take place. Now, I see this as a hardening of the Russian position, because my recollection is that when Putin spoke in June, he was talking about a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from the 4 regions. He wasn't at that time saying that Ukraine also needed to abandon its bid for NATO membership. But my understanding is that that is indeed what the Russians are now insisting upon. So there we see how the Russian position is gradually stiffening. They do say that they're prepared to enter into negotiations. They will negotiate with the Ukrainians tomorrow. The Ukrainians must first, before anything else, rescind Zelensky's decree of September 2022, which prohibited Ukraine from negotiating with Russia so long as President Putin remained in office. Zelensky has never given the slightest indication that he is prepared to do that. He has spoken, and by the way, he continues to speak, as if a diplomatic solution can be achieved without negotiations. He wants Ukraine to enter NATO. He says that there will be no ceasefire unless that happens. If Ukraine enters NATO, he's telling everybody then the fighting will stop, because the Russians will be too frightened, presumably, to continue with the war. And then when the fighting stops, a peace conference can be arranged and the Russians can be bullied into complete capitulation and disgorging the regions, and the 4 regions and Crimea, and there is no need for formal negotiations to take place. That is my understanding of Zelensky's position. And I don't get the sense that he personally has ever shifted from it. So, here is what I think is going to happen. Trump is going to become president in January. He is going to call Putin. Putin will tell him that yes, the Russians are prepared to negotiate with the Ukrainians. They always have been. They're not prepared to agree a ceasefire unless certain things are agreed first. And firstly, Ukraine must withdraw completely from the 4 regions and must also say that it is not going to join NATO. I don't think Trump will push back. His instinct will be to push back hard on that. I think he will tell the Ukrainians that this is a reasonable deal and that as far as he's concerned, they should take it. The Ukrainians will not take it. They might eventually be pushed out of the 4 regions, but I think they will continue to say that membership of NATO is for them non-negotiable, and they will be looking to their friends in Europe for support in that stance. And on that basis, Trump will say, well, he's done what he can. Aid to Ukraine will gradually tail off, and the Ukrainians will be left to their own devices, fighting the Russians with whatever help the Europeans can give them. So that, I think, based on what I have seen over the last couple of days, is where we're going. Now, what would that mean for Ukraine? Well, first of all, it's important to say that the military situation on the front lines continues to tilt badly against them. The Ukrainians over the last couple of days have been making all kinds of claims that they have recaptured the village of Novi Komar, which lies immediately north of Velikaya Novosilka, so that Velikaya Novosilka isn't actually encircled, but then they contradict their own claims by publishing footage of drone attacks on Russian troops in Novi Komar. So it looks like the Russians are actually still there. The Russians are continuing to clear up all of the territories south of Kurakovo. In fact, the Russian advance here has been not only very rapid, but the Ukrainian defenses have become increasingly fragmented, and the Ukrainians in Kurakovo itself are now said to be bottled up in a small area in the west of this relatively small town. Further north, the Russians have been making very rapid advances indeed towards Pokrovsk itself. There is a large village south of Pokrovsk called Shevchenko. It lies to the southwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians are said to control around 20% of this village. The Ukrainians are doing everything they can to cling on, but everybody knows that at some point in the next couple of days or weeks at most, Shevchenko will have passed fully under Russian control. Once Shevchenko comes under Russian control, the Russians are in a good position to cut off the supply lines to Ukraine from the west, from Dnipro and from the Dnieper. Elsewhere, the Russians have apparently not only occupied the 3 remaining slag heaps of the central mine in Toretsk, but they've encircled the Ukrainian troops allegedly in Toretsk itself, in the central mine buildings in Toretsk. And again, it looks as if once this position is captured by the Russians, all that is left are the small buildings, cottages, the residential houses, many of them, I suspect, brick or wooden, that make up the suburbs, the northern suburbs of Toretsk, which do not form effective defensive structures and which the Russians should be able to capture fairly quickly. The Russians also, it is said, are close to clearing the industrial area of Chasiv Yar. And lastly, group of forces north is saying that not only is Plekhovo, this village south of Suja, recaptured, but that the Russians have advanced significantly to the west beyond it. And there are even some claims on the military summary channel and elsewhere that the Russians are preparing some kind of advance into Sumy region, basically to cut off the supply lines from the city of Sumy to the Kursk pocket, bringing all of the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk pocket into a cauldron. On that topic, by the way, briefly, I saw another article by CNN interviewing a Ukrainian soldier in Kursk. He too knows nothing about any North Korean troops there. So, on every part of the front lines, things are very bad for Ukraine. The Russians have been carrying out massive missile and bombing attacks on the Ukrainian railway system over the last 24 hours. The energy system is in crisis. Things across Ukraine militarily look extremely bad. At some point, Ukrainian soldiers are probably also going to start to sense that support from the United States is ebbing away. It's very difficult to see how the line can be held in Ukraine in the face of these pressures for very much longer. I appreciate that soldiers on the front lines often are practically oblivious of the larger global picture. But I suspect that at some point, the fact that America is no longer there, providing them with the support, which, by the way, they've always been told has been inadequate, is going to start to percolate through, and inevitably, it's going to have an effect, a further effect on morale. Would Ukrainian soldiers, for example, continued to be willing to fight and die for a tiny place like Novi Komar, a village whose somewhat comical name in Russian, by the way, means new mosquito, just saying. Would they really be willing to continue to fight and die in these sort of places if they no longer believe that the war itself can be won? Discipline probably will keep some soldiers fighting, but already, by universal admission, Ukraine is suffering from a massive desertion problem. And the sense that America is no longer there, that sense, I suspect, is going to compound this desertion problem even further. So it makes no sense to continue the war, given what Zelensky was exposed to in Paris. What Zelensky should be doing is coming back to Kiev, meeting all of the people there, Poroshenko, Zaluzhny, Klitschko, his opponents, Yermak, Podolyak, and the others, Bezuglaya, whomever, and he should tell them briefly that the game is up, that Ukraine cannot win, that it must accept peace, that peace will have to be on Putin's terms, that the 4 regions plus Crimea are lost, that they should agree to withdraw the troops from the 4 regions in order to get the ceasefire, and that they should also agree to do that which they had previously agreed to do in the run-up to the Istanbul negotiations in April 2022, which is to agree to full neutral status and to drop the idea that Ukraine will join NATO. That, I think, is what Zelensky at this point ought to do. And the various European governments and European politicians who have been supporting Ukraine, they should be telling Zelensky the same thing. Starmer in London, Macron in France, Scholz obviously in Germany, Friedrich Merz, likely the next Chancellor of Germany. They should be telling him the same also. Because all of them should know that there is no possibility, not of victory in this war, but of even holding the line in this war for any significant length of time without the United States. The tragedy is that none of these people are going to do this. Zelensky, as I said, wants to talk to Biden about getting accelerated NATO membership. He's now found someone else who he apparently thinks is going to jump on board and become his advocate in Washington and elsewhere, and that is Friedrich Merz of Germany. Merz has just made a truly astonishing statement about how supporting Ukraine to the hilt is the way to end the war quickly, whereas not supporting Ukraine to the hilt is the way to prolong the war. I don't think Donald Trump is going to be impressed by that, based on everything that I have heard him say. And, of course, Trump would be absolutely right, because what Merz is saying is nonsense. But that is what the European leaders are telling Zelensky at the moment. And the rhetoric that continues to come from Zelensky and his officials remains as defiant as ever. I came to the view some time ago that there are some people in the West, in Europe, in the United States, who would rather see Ukraine defeated than see what they judge to be an unsatisfactory peace. I would go further and I would say that there are lots of people in Ukraine, not of course the majority, but a significant minority, that would prefer the same. Rather have the heroic myth, the good old cause, than accept a reduced, diminished Ukraine that cannot live up to their maximalist hopes. Well, we're going to see, I think, over the next few weeks and months, whether the sentiments of these people will continue to prevail. So far, the indications are not good. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day tomorrow, when hopefully, again, I'll be in better voice.